When I attended my cousin's wedding, my seat was in the basement. MIL smirked. Only close family gets a table. Worse, there was no place card for me. Cousin giggled. Guess you don't count. I stood up, took my gift, and said, then I'm leaving. Cousin went pale. I, 32M, never thought my cousin's wedding would become the catalyst for the most satisfying revenge I've ever executed. But life has a way of surprising you, especially when family decides to show their true colors. The whole mess started 3 months ago when I received what I thought was a normal wedding invitation. My cousin and I had grown up together, practically brothers, until his mother decided I wasn't good enough for their family anymore. The invitation was basic, nothing fancy, but I was genuinely happy for him. I'd even spent weeks picking out the perfect gift, a handcrafted chess set that cost me nearly $1,000, knowing how much he loved the game. The first red flag should have been the venue change email I received 2 weeks before the wedding. The ceremony was being moved from the originally planned garden venue to his mother-in-law's estate. When I called to ask about parking and logistics, my cousin seemed nervous, telling me everything would be clearly marked and that I shouldn't worry about anything. The day of the wedding, I drove 2 hours to reach the estate, a sprawling property that screamed old money. The main house was elegant, with manicured gardens and a grand ballroom visible through the windows. I parked where directed and walked toward what I assumed was the main entrance, gift in hand, wearing my best suit. That's when I met the first coordinator, a stern woman with a clipboard who looked me up and down like I was lost. When I told her I was here for the wedding, she asked for my name and spent an uncomfortably long time scanning her list. She finally pointed toward a side entrance and told me to follow the signs to the ceremony area. The signs led me around the house, past the beautiful garden where I could see guests mingling in expensive clothes, past the elegant terrace where servers were setting up what looked like a cocktail hour, and down a set of stone steps to what was unmistakably a basement entrance. I stood there for a moment, thinking there had to be a mistake. But there was another coordinator at the basement door, and when I approached her, she confirmed that yes, this was where I needed to be for the ceremony. The basement had been converted into a secondary ceremony space, she explained, for additional guests. Walking down those stairs felt like descending into an alternate reality. The basement was finished, I'll give them that, but it was still a basement. Folding chairs were arranged in neat rows facing a small altar setup, and about 30 other people were already seated. The lighting was dim, the air was stuffy, and there was no natural light whatsoever. I recognized a few faces, distant relatives, family friends who hadn't made the cut for upstairs, and what appeared to be some college friends of the groom. We were the overflow crowd, the people important enough to invite, but not important enough to matter. The ceremony began with a video feed from upstairs. We watched on a large screen as my cousin exchanged vows in what looked like a gorgeous room filled with flowers and natural light. His mother-in-law, who I'd never met but had heard countless stories about, was clearly visible in the front row, dabbing her eyes with an expensive handkerchief. After the ceremony, we were directed to remain in the basement for our own reception. The staff brought down a basic meal, chicken, vegetables, and rolls that tasted like they'd been sitting under heat lamps for hours. Meanwhile, the video feed showed the upstairs guests enjoying what looked like a gourmet feast with multiple courses and an open bar. Our basement bar consisted of beer, cheap wine, and soda. The conversation around me was subdued, everyone clearly aware that we were experiencing the budget version of this celebration. I spent most of the dinner picking at my food and trying to process what was happening. When it came time for the toasts, we watched on the screen as person after person stood to speak about the couple. Family members, close friends, the best man, the maid of honor, all people who were deemed worthy of sitting upstairs. Then the groom's mother stood up, and my blood pressure started to rise. She talked about family, about how important it was to surround yourself with people who truly mattered, people who had proven their worth and their loyalty. She mentioned how grateful she was that her son had found such a wonderful partner from such a distinguished family, and how excited she was to welcome all the truly important people in their lives to this celebration. The camera panned across the upstairs crowd, and I could see the satisfaction on faces of people who knew they'd made the cut. Meanwhile, we basement dwellers sat in silence, the message crystal clear. After dinner, I decided I needed to find my cousin. I'd brought an expensive gift, I'd driven 2 hours, and I deserved an explanation. I made my way upstairs, where the real party was in full swing. The contrast was jarring: crystal chandeliers, live music, elegant decorations, and guests who looked like they'd stepped out of a magazine. I found my cousin near the bar, looking uncomfortable when he saw me approaching. Before I could say anything, his mother-in-law appeared beside him like a protective shield. She was everything I'd imagined, perfectly coiffed, wearing jewelry that probably cost more than my car, and radiating the kind of confidence that comes from never having to worry about money. When I mentioned that I'd been looking for my cousin to congratulate him properly, she looked at me with barely concealed disdain. She told me that this area was reserved for immediate family and close friends, and that I should probably return to where I belonged. The way she said it, like I was some kind of intruder, made my jaw clench. My cousin stood there saying nothing, avoiding eye contact like a guilty child. His wife, who I was meeting for the first time, looked between us with obvious discomfort but didn't speak up either. The silence stretched on until the mother-in-law suggested again that I should return downstairs where I'd be more comfortable with people from my own background. I asked my cousin directly if this was really how he wanted to handle things, if relegating me to the basement was his idea, or if he was just going along with someone else's plan. He finally looked at me, but instead of apologizing or explaining, he told me that this was how things had to be, that not everyone could sit at the main tables, and that I should understand that family dynamics were complicated. His mother appeared from nowhere, as if she'd been monitoring the situation. She joined the circle and immediately began defending the seating arrangements. She explained that venue space was limited and that they'd had to make difficult decisions about who could be accommodated upstairs. She said that only the closest family members and most important friends had been given main floor seating, and that everyone else was perfectly comfortable in the alternative space they'd arranged. The way she kept emphasizing closest family, and most important, felt like deliberate jabs. I'd grown up with my cousin, been to his birthday parties, helped him through tough times, and considered him one of my closest relatives. But apparently, I didn't make the cut. When I asked about my place card, thinking maybe there had been some mistake with the seating arrangements, my cousin's wife finally spoke up. She told me with a little laugh that there probably wasn't a place card for me upstairs because I wasn't actually assigned to a main floor table. She said it like it was obvious, like I should have known my place from the beginning. That's when I realized this wasn't about venue limitations or logistics. This was intentional. They had deliberately created a hierarchy for this wedding, with the basement serving as a holding area for people they couldn't completely exclude but didn't want to actually include. I stood there for a moment, processing the situation. These people had taken my invitation, my gift, my time, and my genuine happiness for my cousin, and they'd used it all while making it clear that I wasn't worthy of their main event. The mother-in-law was smirking at me, clearly enjoying my discomfort and probably hoping I'd just slink back to the basement like a good little second-class relative. Instead, I walked over to the gift table, found my expensive chest set among the pile of presents, and picked it up. The action caught everyone's attention, and conversations around us started to die down as people noticed what was happening. I told my cousin that since I apparently didn't count as close family, I'd be taking my gift and leaving. I said it loud enough for nearby guests to hear, and I watched my cousin's face go completely pale. His wife looked mortified, his mother started protesting, and his mother-in-law's smirk disappeared entirely. My cousin tried to stop me, suddenly finding his voice and telling me that I was overreacting, that I should put the gift back and just enjoy the party. But I was done being accommodating. I told him that he'd made his choice about what kind of family member I was, and now I was making mine. As I walked toward the exit, I could hear heated whispered conversations breaking out behind me. Other guests were clearly confused about what was happening, and someone was asking why the groom's cousin was leaving with his gift. I didn't look back as I walked out of that house, but I could feel the stares following me. The drive home gave me 2 hours to think about what had just happened and what I wanted to do about it. Update 1. The fallout began almost immediately. I wasn't even home yet when my phone started buzzing with calls and texts from various family members. Word travels fast in families, especially when someone makes a scene at a wedding. My aunt, my cousin's mother, was the first to call. She was furious, demanding to know how I could embarrass her son like that on his wedding day. She told me that I'd ruined the whole celebration with my selfish behavior, and that taking back my gift was the most petty thing she'd ever witnessed. I let her vent for a few minutes before explaining exactly what had happened. I described the basement ceremony, the clear hierarchy they'd established, and the way her son and his new family had treated me like an unwanted obligation. She tried to defend their choices, saying that wedding planning was stressful and that space limitations were real. But when I mentioned the mother-in-law's smirking and the comment about only close family getting tables, my aunt's tone shifted. She asked me to repeat exactly what had been said, and I could hear her anger building. My aunt might not have always treated me perfectly, but she had strong opinions about family respect and public embarrassment. Other relatives started calling throughout the evening. My uncle, who hadn't been at the wedding, was appalled when he heard the story. He told me that he'd been wondering why he hadn't received an invitation and now understood that there had probably been multiple tiers of guests, with many family members not making the cut at all. The most interesting call came from my cousin's brother, who had been at the wedding but upstairs with the preferred guests. He told me that after I left, The questions started flying. Other guests wanted to know why the groom's cousin had just stormed out with his gift, and my cousin had to explain what happened. According to his brother, my cousin tried to downplay the situation, claiming it was just a misunderstanding about seating arrangements. But his mother-in-law apparently couldn't leave it alone. She kept making comments about how some people couldn't handle not being the center of attention and how they dodged a bullet by finding out what kind of person I really was. This backfired spectacularly. Several guests, including some from the bride's side, started asking pointed questions about the basement setup. They wanted to know why family members were being segregated and whether other people had been treated similarly. The mother-in-law's satisfaction quickly turned to damage control as she realized her comments were making the situation worse, not better. The best part came when one of the bride's aunts, apparently a woman with some social standing in their circles, loudly declared that she'd never heard of family members being relegated to a basement at a wedding. She said it was tacky and cruel, and that if this was how they treated family, she couldn't imagine how they'd treat friends. My cousin's brother told me that the rest of the reception was tense, with multiple small conversations happening about what had just occurred. The joyful celebration atmosphere was definitely damaged, and several guests left earlier than planned. But the real consequences were just beginning. Update 2. The week following the wedding brought a series of developments that exceeded my wildest expectations. My phone barely stopped ringing as the story spread through our extended family network, and each conversation revealed new information about the fallout. My grandmother, the family matriarch who commands respect from everyone, called 3 days after the wedding. She'd heard multiple versions of the story and wanted to get the facts directly from me. After I explained everything, she was silent for a long moment before telling me that she was proud of me for standing up for myself and that what my cousin had done was unacceptable. More importantly, she revealed that she'd been intentionally excluded from the wedding entirely. My cousin had told her that they were keeping it small and intimate, but she'd later learned from other relatives that it was actually a large affair. She was hurt and angry about being lied to, and my story confirmed her suspicions that there had been deliberate exclusions based on some kind of social hierarchy. She told me she was planning to have a serious conversation with my aunt about how her son was treating family members, and that there would be consequences for this behavior. The social media situation was equally satisfying. While I hadn't posted anything about the wedding, other family members had, and the comments sections were becoming battlegrounds. Relatives who hadn't been invited were asking questions. People were sharing their own stories of being excluded from family events, and my cousin's wedding posts were attracting negative attention. My cousin tried to control the narrative by posting about what a wonderful day it had been and how grateful he was for all the love and support. But the comments quickly filled with pointed questions about why certain family members hadn't been there or had been treated poorly. Several relatives openly stated that they were disappointed in how things had been handled. The bride's family was also dealing with fallout. According to mutual acquaintances, the mother-in-law was receiving criticism from her own social circle about the basement seating arrangement. Apparently, word had spread that family members were being treated as second-class guests, and this didn't reflect well on their family's reputation for hospitality and class. One particularly damaging piece of information came from my cousin's college friend, who reached out to me directly. He told me that he'd also been seated in the basement despite being in the wedding party for my cousin's bachelor party and having known him for over a decade. He was reconsidering their friendship after realizing how little he apparently meant to my cousin when it came to important events. He also shared that several other basement guests had been talking about the situation, and many of them were feeling hurt and excluded. They'd all brought gifts, taken time off work, and traveled to attend what they thought was a celebration of someone they cared about, only to discover they were basically unwanted obligations. But the most significant development came when my cousin finally called me directly. He was clearly distressed, telling me that the situation had gotten out of hand and that people were misunderstanding what had happened. He wanted to explain the real reasons behind the seating arrangements and hoped we could work things out. I listened as he tried to justify everything. He told me that his mother-in-law had very specific ideas about wedding traditions and social protocols. She'd insisted that certain people needed to be seated according to their relationship to the bride and groom, and that space limitations in the main ballroom had made difficult decisions necessary. He claimed that the basement setup was meant to be a nice alternative space, not a punishment, and that he genuinely thought people would be comfortable there. He said he never intended to hurt anyone's feelings and that he was sorry if I'd felt excluded. I told him that his explanations didn't change what had actually happened. Whether he intended it or not, he'd created a situation where family members were clearly ranked in order of importance, and I'd been placed at the bottom of that list. The mother-in-law's comments and his wife's dismissive attitude had made it clear that this wasn't about logistics. It was about who they considered worthy of respect. He tried to convince me to attend a family dinner where we could talk things through properly, but I declined. I told him that his actions had shown me exactly where I stood in his priorities, and that I wasn't interested in pretending everything was fine just to make him feel better. Update 3. 2 weeks after the wedding, the consequences reached their peak in ways I never could have anticipated. The family dinner my cousin had suggested turned into a full-scale family meeting that I didn't attend but heard about in detail from multiple sources. My grandmother had organized the gathering, ostensibly to discuss the wedding situation, but really to address what she saw as a broader problem with how family members were treating each other. According to my uncle, who was there, it was intense. My cousin and his mother were put on the defensive immediately. My grandmother laid out the facts as she understood them. Family members being excluded entirely, others being relegated to basement seating, and deliberate lies told about wedding size and guest limitations. She made it clear that this behavior was unacceptable and reflected poorly on the family's values. The most dramatic moment came when my cousin's mother tried to blame everything on the bride's family, claiming that they'd pressured her son into making these decisions. My grandmother shut that down immediately, pointing out that my cousin was a grown man who could have stood up for his family if he'd chosen to. Several other relatives spoke up about their own experiences with feeling excluded from family events, and it became clear that this wedding was just the latest example of a pattern of behavior. My cousin's mother had apparently been making decisions about who was worthy of inclusion in various family gatherings for years, and people were finally calling her out. But the real bombshell came when my cousin's brother revealed something he'd been keeping quiet. He told the group that he'd overheard his mother and the mother-in-law planning the seating arrangements weeks before the wedding. They'd specifically discussed putting certain relatives in the basement because they didn't want them mixing with the bride's more affluent family and friends. This wasn't about space limitations or logistics. It was about class and social status, pure and simple. They'd been embarrassed by some of their own family members and had created the basement solution to hide them away while still technically including them. The room erupted after that revelation. My uncle was furious, several aunts were demanding apologies, and my cousin was trying desperately to distance himself from his mother's planning decisions. But the damage was done. Everyone now knew that the basement seating was intentional discrimination. My grandmother delivered the final verdict. She announced that until my cousin and his mother made genuine apologies to everyone who had been mistreated, they would not be welcome at future family gatherings that she hosted or organized. Since my grandmother's approval was essential for most major family events, this was essentially a social banishment. She also made it clear that she expected better behavior going forward, and that anyone who continued to treat family members as second-class citizens would face similar consequences. The aftermath of this meeting was swift and decisive. My cousin called me that same evening, and for the first time, he sounded genuinely remorseful. He admitted that the seating arrangements had been wrong, that he'd allowed himself to be influenced by people who didn't share his family's values, and that he was sorry for hurting me and others. He asked if there was anything he could do to make things right, and I told him that actions mattered more than words. If he was serious about changing, he needed to start treating all family members with equal respect, regardless of what his wife's family thought about them. His mother also reached out, though her apology was less convincing. She focused mainly on how the situation had been misunderstood and how she'd never intended to hurt anyone's feelings. But she did acknowledge that mistakes had been made and that she'd handle things differently in the future. The bride's family, meanwhile, was dealing with their own consequences. Word of the basement wedding had spread beyond our family, and the mother-in-law was facing criticism from her social circle about the tacky treatment of guests. Several of her friends had apparently expressed shock that anyone would segregate family members at a wedding, and her reputation for hosting elegant events was taking a hit. Most satisfying was learning that several other family members had taken inspiration from my actions. My cousin's college friend had returned his wedding gift and ended their friendship. 2 relatives who'd been excluded entirely had sent formal letters expressing their disappointment. And at least 3 basement guests had decided to skip my cousin's upcoming housewarming party in protest. The chess set I'd reclaimed was sitting on my coffee table, and every time I looked at it, I felt proud of my decision to stand up for myself. I'd learned an important lesson about family dynamics. Sometimes you have to be willing to walk away to make people understand your worth. My cousin's wedding had revealed the true character of several family members, and while it was painful to see, it was also valuable information. I now knew exactly who I could count on and who saw me as disposable. The final update came when my grandmother called to tell me that my cousin and his wife would be hosting a small gathering to properly apologize to everyone who'd been mistreated at the wedding. She'd made it clear that this wasn't optional if they wanted to remain in good standing with the family. I told her I'd consider attending, but that my trust would take time to rebuild. Some damage can't be undone with a single apology, especially when it reveals such fundamental differences in values and respect. The basement seat had taught me more about family than I'd ever wanted to know, but it had also shown me the importance of standing up for myself when others won't. Sometimes the best gift you can give yourself is the refusal to accept disrespectful treatment, even from people you love.